Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are here today to discuss a problem that has no easy solution, yet we ignore it at our peril. It's the Afghan drug trade. It contributes to nearly every problem Afghanistan faces. The narcotics trade funds the Taliban, it increases corruption, and it poses a serious public health challenge in Afghanistan and abroad. As the United States draw down their troops in the country, we must find a way to sustain our counter-narcotics efforts and improve those policies that have not worked as well as we might, or as well as they should, and we need to improve them. Unfortunately, there is little good news coming out of this country on counter-narcotics. First, as you can see on the chart behind me, poppy cultivation reached a record level of 209,000 hectares in 2013. So it's up 36% from the 2012 level. That's over a third increase in 1 year. Second, the Taliban continues to finance its terrorist activities through the drug trade. Estimates suggest the Taliban receives between $100 and $150 million a year from narcotics-related activity, a significant portion of its estimated $400 million annual budget. As just one example, a 2012 Afghan drug kingpin, Haji Bachko, was sentenced to life in prison in the United States on drug trafficking and narco-terrorism charges. According to the Department of Justice, Bachko used some of his drugs proceeds to provide cash and arms to the former Taliban governor of Nangarhar and two Taliban commanders who are responsible for insurgency activity in eastern Afghanistan. In July 2010, the Senate Caucus on International Narcotics Control released a report on this country, arguing that the Taliban's financial involvement in the drug trade poses a threat to our nation's security. That's no less true today than it was 3.5 years ago. And last but not least, there are 1.6 million opiate addicts in that country, which is over 5% of the country's population. In advance of today's hearing, we provided our witnesses with 8 draft recommendations on how we could sustain and improve our counter-narcotics efforts in this country, Afghanistan, in the coming years. So I'd like to highlight just a few of them, and the purpose for giving you all of them is that we'd like to hear what you think about them, what you think will work, what you think won't work. First, as our funding declines, we need to internationalize our counter-narcotics efforts in Afghanistan. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimates that Russia may be the largest consumer of Afghan heroin in the world, with 1.7 million opiate users. The United States and Russia might and should work together much more closely in combating this drug trade and encouraging other countries to contribute to the effort. Iran has a major impact. It's my understanding that literally thousands of border patrol agents from Iran have been killed trying to enforce the Iranian border. So there may be many areas of disagreement that we have with Iran, but this is one area where we should agree, and counter-narcotics is that area. Second, I have been very supportive of the Helmand Food Zone program, which is an integrated approach to eliminating poppy cultivation that includes eradication, alternative development, a public information campaign, and drug demand reduction. As a matter of fact, I had the privilege of meeting with the president's person for counter-narcotics, Dr. Osmani, on I think 3 occasions. He is now the foreign minister of the country, and so I guess is no longer connected to these food zones. but the effort is now being replicated with our support in Kandahar. And in carrying out this program, I think it's really important to not simply focus on crop substitution, but also look at non-farm income. Far too often, alternative crops are promoted where they are susceptible to crop failure and for which there are no domestic or international markets. So our suggestion is that a greater focus be placed on promoting manufacturing, providing micro-lending so that individuals can start small businesses. Third, the DEA has provided key support to Afghan-led vetted units, which target drug kingpins and terrorist financing earned through the drug trade. United States funding in Afghanistan should continue to support these units. So I very much welcome the witnesses here today. Well, Mr. Brownfield, you have been here before. It's good to see you, and at the appropriate time, I will ask the distinguished gentleman on my right, the Vice Chairman of this committee, to make his remarks and then be the first one to ask questions. And so perhaps you would make your opening remarks. I'll quickly introduce the witnesses as a whole, and then you ask your questions.
First of all, I'll respond to a letter you wrote me that referred to the recommendations that you just gave, and you asked if I and you and our staffs could work together to on those, and I pledge to do that.
Thank you very much.
So you know that we can work together on that. Madam Chairman, I thank you for holding this hearing to follow up on our two previous hearings about Afghan counter-narcotic programs. This discussion is especially timely because of the drawdown of our troops this year having significant impact on these programs. Today's hearing gives us an opportunity to hear from the administration about the future of these programs going forward. Our efforts in this area are highly dependent on the security that our military provides. Therefore, I've long been concerned that if our troops were withdrawn completely from Afghanistan, and if it was too abrupt or without proper planning, the United States could forfeit the progress that has been made against drug trade. Indeed, in July 2010, Chairman Feinstein and I released a bipartisan caucus report regarding the U.S. counter-narcotics strategy in Afghanistan. In that report, we recommended that the key agencies involved in counter-narcotics, quote, devise a comprehensive strategy for continued operational effectiveness after the departure of U.S. troops, end of quote. At the time of our hearing in 2011, the Obama administration was already beginning to reduce the number of troops there. I raised concerns then that we could lose our counter-narcotics successes in the rush to reduce our presence. Indeed, we're already seeing some of our progress being eroded, and I'll skip over at this point some of the statistics I have because the chairman's already referred to those. Additionally, the administration's failure yet to finalize a bilateral security agreement with the Afghan government is undoubtedly damaging our ability to plan future counter-narcotics efforts. As we're seeing in Iraq, without such an agreement in place, the country may well descend into chaos. We shouldn't forget why our troops are in Afghanistan in the first place. Narcotic trafficking in Afghanistan helped fuel a mix of corruption, organized crime, instability that helped a mix of corruption, organized crime, and instability that in turn helped to lead to the rise of the Taliban. And the Taliban then provided a safe haven from which al-Qaeda launched its September 11th attacks. Counter-narcotics efforts in Afghanistan play a role in ensuring that terrorist organizations cannot use the country as a base from which to threaten our country. As we reduce the number of troops in Afghanistan, we need to focus our efforts on continuing to build the capabilities of the Afghan military, police, and courts. We also need to ensure that our law enforcement agencies, such as the DEA, will still be allowed to work alongside Afghan personnel to conduct operations and investigations. We should also prioritize our efforts to combat the money laundering and terrorist financing associated with the proceeds of narcotics exported from Afghanistan. In 2012, the estimated value of the opiates before export was almost $2 billion. So it's quite obvious, as we know, these funds support both the insurgency against the Afghan government as well as criminal and terrorist activities here in this country, or directed against this country. It is critical that plans are in place to deal with how counter-narcotics efforts will continue absent the security provided by the U.S. military. As the Drug Caucus recommended in July 2010 report, I strongly encourage this administration to provide Congress with comprehensive, multi-agency workable strategy to do so. So I look forward to this hearing from the witnesses today regarding the status of counter-narcotics plans of their individual agencies, as well as their concerns as we reduce our military footprint, and maybe even with emphasis upon those concerns as we reduce our footprint. I'm also interested in being updated about what's working and what's not working in our current efforts to combat this trafficking. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Grassley. I'd like to introduce the witnesses now and tell you how grateful we are that you're here. It is really important. We've done 2 prior reports, and we're going to stick with this subject. I am very worried about where this thing goes and what happens. So let me introduce our witnesses. On my left is Ambassador William Brownfield. I want to welcome him back to our caucus. He's been here before. Ambassador Brownfield is the Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. He has previously served as United States Ambassador to Colombia, Venezuela, and Chile. Next, I'd like to welcome James Capra. He is the Chief of Operations at the DEA. As Chief, Mr. Capra is the Principal Advisor to DEA Administrator Michelle Lenhart on all enforcement-related matters, including DEA's global operations. Mr. Capra was appointed as Chief of Operations in August of 2012, and he has served with DEA for 25 years. Thank you so much. Next, we are pleased to have Erin Logan. Ms. Logan is the Principal Director for Counter-Narcotics and Global Threats at the Department of Defense. As Principal Director, she is responsible for the oversight of the Defense Department's global counter-narcotics policy and resources, as well as management of department policies for counter-threat finance, counter-piracy, and countering transnational organized crime. Ms. Logan previously worked for then Senator Biden of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And last, but certainly not the least, I'd like to welcome John Sopko, the Special IG for Afghan Reconstruction. Mr. Sopko's office was created by Congress to conduct oversight on the effectiveness of U.S. assistance to Afghanistan. He has over 20 years of experience serving on staffs in both the Senate and the House, and has worked as a state and federal prosecutor for investigations and prosecutions against organized crime groups. So, to this distinguished lady and gentleman, we're very happy to have you here. Senator, would you proceed with questions?
Oh, I thought they don't give testimony?
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. I skipped a whole part of this.
Yeah,
Do you think that's Freudian? I don't want to hear.
As you wish.
No, Mr. Brownsfield. You're on.
Thank you anyway.
I shall then be honored to launch. Madam Chairman, Chairman Feinstein, Co-Chairman Grassley, thank you for the opportunity to appear today to discuss counter-narcotics efforts in Afghanistan. The subject is incredibly important, and this caucus has been ahead of the entire United States government in recognizing that fact. Your excellent findings and recommendations issued last week in your letter clearly demonstrate this. Madam Chairman, I have a written statement that, with your permission, I will submit for the record and offer a brief summary.
Permission granted.
Senators, we know that Afghanistan is the source of more than 80% of the world's illegal opiates, that drugs represent the largest domestic source of income for the Taliban. But as we assess drug strategy for the future, there are key facts that we do not know. We do not know the security picture that we will encounter after 2014, or the exact contours of the bilateral relationship, or the resources that will be available to us, or the posture of the international community. We have learned some lessons in the past 40 years of international drug programs applicable throughout the entire world. Drug strategies take time. It takes years to get into these crises and years to resolve them. Drug strategies must be comprehensive. You cannot solve a crisis by addressing just one single element. And drug strategies must be adaptable, capable of responding to inevitable changes by the trafficking adversary. With an eye on new realities in Afghanistan after 2014, the INL Bureau recently reviewed its programs that currently operate under the Interagency Afghanistan Drug Strategy, approved in December of 2012. We concluded that our drug program should be driven by 5 guiding principles. First, focus efforts on sustainable Afghan capabilities. Capacity building is more important than equipment and must be sustainable over the long term. Second, emphasize Afghan priorities and strategies in our programming. If there is no Afghan buy-in, the strategy will not succeed. Third, deliver on previous commitments. If we lose the trust of the Afghan people, cooperation will wither. Fourth, integrate international donors and regional partners into our strategy. We cannot do this alone. And fifth and finally, given the changing security and resource realities after 2014, we must adjust our monitoring and evaluation strategies to ensure taxpayer funds are protected and programs are as effective as they possibly can be. Senators, you will find in my written statement a summary of our counter-drug programs in Afghanistan. You will read of programs designed to address crop control, eradication, alternative development, interdiction, prosecution, training and capacity building, and demand reduction. You will read of some of our efforts to engage important international partners in the UN, the UK, other European institutions, and Central Asian governments. You will read of our proposed tiered approach to monitoring and evaluation, where we use the best available sources to evaluate our programs in the field in light of security and resources. I hope you find the outline of a comprehensive drug strategy. Madam Chairman, I read the media like you and everyone else. I detect pessimism in much of the reporting. I do not share it any more than I shared the pessimism of those who reported as late as 2007 that Plan Colombia was a failure. I do not promise you a successful resolution of the Afghanistan counter-narcotics challenge this year or next year, but I do promise, with your support, a sustainable and adaptable counter-narcotics program that builds capacities for the Afghan government to address drug challenges in the post-2014 era. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Mr. Brownsfield. Mr. Capra?
Thank you, Chairman Feinstein, Co-Chairman Grassley. I am very honored to be here with you today, and I would offer my written statement for the record, ma'am. I would ask that be submitted.
So ordered.
Chairman Feinstein, Chairman, Co-Chairman Grassley, and distinguished members of the Caucus, on behalf of Administrator Linhart and the Drug Enforcement Administration, I appreciate your invitation to testify today regarding DEA's counter-narcotics strategy in Afghanistan. DEA's core mission is to disrupt and dismantle the most significant drug trafficking organizations posing the greatest threat to the United States. The DEA program in Afghanistan is specifically designed to deny narcotics-generated funding to terrorism and the insurgency by conducting bilateral investigations, breaking the nexus between the insurgency and drug trafficking, promoting the rule of law, and exposing and reducing corruption while diminishing the overall drug threat from Afghanistan. As we already know, the United Nations has estimated that the international drug trade generates $322 billion per year in revenue, making drugs by far the most lucrative illicit activity. According to the UN, revenues from other types of illicit transnational activities such as arms trafficking, alien smuggling, and diamond smuggling as well are small by comparison. The narcotics trade in Afghanistan, as you well know, undermines the illicit economic development, enables corruption, erodes government legitimacy, facilitates transnational organized crime, and threatens stability, security, and the rule of law in Afghanistan and across the region. The Taliban receives millions annually from narcotics-related activities, including taxation, protection, and extortion. The Taliban is involved in taxing opium poppy farmers, operating processing labs, moving narcotics, taxing narcotics transporters passing through Taliban checkpoints in our Taliban-controlled territory. They also provide security to poppy fields, drug labs, and opium bazaars, as well as collecting donations. We understand that with poppy cultivation increasing in the country, it can be assumed that the Taliban profits will also continue to rise, fueling further instability worldwide. DEA is fully supportive of the government of Afghanistan and its national drug control strategy. This strategy reaffirms the U.S. commitment to assist Afghanistan in breaking the narcotics insurgency nexus and reinforcing the legitimacy of its governmental institutions. With the expected drawdown of U.S. combat forces, DEA's efforts will remain focused on supporting counter-narcotics programs, which are effective and sustainable by the government of Afghanistan. We understand the challenges, but DEA will transition our operational profile to correspond with traditional DEA overseas operations, conducting bilateral investigations that target significant trafficking organizations while advising and assisting selected host nation law enforcement units, collecting drug-related intelligence, and supporting domestic DEA investigations. To meet this commitment, DEA must maintain a sufficient staffing level in Afghanistan. We continue to develop the capability and capacity of the specialized vetted units of the Counter-Narcotics Police in Afghanistan to address the illicit drug trade, enabling the vetted units to independently combat the narcotics trade by conducting complex, multinational narcotics investigations with gradually increasing degrees of responsibility and ownership, which they have started doing. We continue to foster an enduring U.S.-Afghan partnership for the long term and reinforce broader U.S. security goals in the region. The threat from the drug trade in Afghanistan is far from over. It is critical that we sustain the positive momentum to preserve security gains made over the past decade. Administrator Linhart and the men and women of the DEA are committed to standing with our interagency colleagues and Afghan counterparts to build a sustainable and effective program in Afghanistan that protects U.S. national security interests. I thank you for your time, and I will look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Mr.
ma'am.
Capra. Ms. Logan?
Madam Chair, Co-Chairman Grassley, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today on behalf of the Department of Defense. As you can imagine, I'm particularly pleased to be here, having spent so much of my career as a professional staff member on the Foreign Relations Committee for the former chair of this caucus, and quite frankly, to have the opportunity to testify with another former Senate alum and with my distinguished colleagues with whom we work so closely on a daily basis. With your permission, Madam Chair, I would like to have my written statement included in the record, and I would just take a few minutes to highlight 3 key themes and to provide you some initial feedback on the 8 recommendations that you were kind enough to share last week.
So ordered.
As the members of the caucus well know, since 2001, the United States has made an extraordinary investment in blood and treasure to eliminate the terrorist safe haven that Afghanistan had become. To date, 2,301 Americans have lost their lives in Operation Enduring Freedom, and another 19,573 have been wounded. DoD has invested approximately $2 billion for dedicated CN training and programs, which is a small fraction of the almost $570 billion we, the United States, have spent on this war since 2001. That said, we do believe that $2 billion has been well spent. We have a CN seed that is now sprouted and includes all of the elements needed to successfully grow. But that growth will only happen if we nurture and protect what we have planted. It is all there, but we must nurture it. As we look at the future of Afghanistan, it is impossible to envision success without sustaining an Afghan capability to fight the violence and corruption created by the drug trade. In addition, we cannot ignore the growing threat to ourselves and our allies. Our Canadian partners estimate that 90% of the heroin on their streets comes from Afghanistan. They also believe that they are seeing more heroin on their streets than their user population can absorb. We must all be sensitive to information like this when combined with the governor of Vermont recently issuing a State of the State speech focused entirely on Vermont's exploding heroin problem. I know this caucus would agree that we must be vigilant about the possibility of Afghan-produced heroin becoming more available across the U.S., or certainly because of the global trade lowering the price. DoD, as always, is committed to disrupting the flow of these drugs as far away from our shores as possible. Our CN strategy for post-2014 in Afghanistan can be summarized by saying we believe we have to focus in 3 areas. 1, continued support for the vetted units that DEA has so ably set up. 2, continued aviation capacity building. And 3, continued leveraging of international interagency capabilities. First, the vetted units. These units have shown that they are willing and able to do the job, and more vetted units are now able to plan, execute, and follow through on CN missions on their own. For example, just a couple of weeks ago, on December 18th, the DoD supported and the DEA mentored Sensitive Investigative Unit was able to use judicial wire intercepts to build a case that led to not just the arrest of 2 criminals, but the seizure of 660 grams of heroin, 500 boxes of ammunition, 40 remote control IEDs, and 75 rocket-propelled grenades. That's an incredible success story, and that was Afghan-led and run, that operation. Again, a unit that DEA mentored and that we have supported. Second, continuing to support the building of Afghan's aviation capability. I cannot overstate how vital we believe this is for the terrain of Afghanistan. For any security effort, and certainly to run effective CN operations, Afghan forces must have adequate air mobility to enhance their effectiveness and the safety of CN operations in the remote areas where insurgents and illicit drug networks operate. My office's focus has been the Special Mission Wing, which has demonstrated the capability now to completely plan and execute operations without international assistance. The Special Mission Wing now has the aircraft necessary to begin to run both vital operations, to continue training personnel, and to keep the aircraft safely maintained. That said, our experiences in Colombia and elsewhere illustrate that it can take a decade or more for an aviation capability to become truly self-sustaining. In a nation like Afghanistan, where budgetary pressures will be high, it may take longer. That said, we do believe that with sustained support, we are very confident the Special Mission Wing can continue to make progress. Third, I would be remiss if I did not point out that the vetted units and aviation capability are part of a complete structure that the interagency and international community have worked hard to create. The U.S.-supported Counternarcotics Justice Center has shown that it can expeditiously and independently process high-level narcotics cases. An article just this week described the role Afghan border police, many of whom were trained by the U.S. Border Management Task Force that DoD supported, had in restoring Afghan's national treasures to its museum. That's a huge success story for them, both in terms of their culture and the chance for revenues, quite frankly, from controlling their borders. The Counternarcotics Police of Afghanistan continue to make progress as a reliable CN law enforcement partner. And on the international interagency front, we've seen solid returns on the U.S.-UK Joint Narcotics Analysis Center, the Interagency Operations Coordination Center, the Combined Joint Interagency Task Force Nexus, and the Afghanistan Threat Finance Cell. As our strategy highlighted, we believe that as we draw down on Afghanistan, we need to explore creative ways to retain some of the effective targeting and intelligence fusion that we've been able to develop with these partners. Starting small, we believe we can support a regional hub for those capabilities by modestly expanding current work done by law enforcement and intelligence to facilitate interdictions, seizures, investigations, and prosecutions based out of Bahrain. You may have heard of Operation Riptide, but it's a very small cell that we think is proving successful. Our vision is to create a reach-back capability for Afghanistan and a more effective capability for targeting the illicit traffic that is departing the Makram coast of Pakistan and Iran to Africa and beyond. For example, our Canadian partners in Combined Maritime Forces Bahrain, specifically the great crew of the HMCS Toronto, had 7 seizures in 2013. We estimate that just 1% of the value of those seizures removed from the high seas is equal to the amount of funding necessary to outfit a platoon of insurgents. That's incredible. A regional targeting center would allow us to retain valuable working relationships that enhance our ability to identify, track, board, and seize illicit cargo on the high seas, and expand our ability to attack these networks with law enforcement partners on land. It will require us to operate across combatant commands, but we believe that is essential to effectively combating the global heroin trade. And finally, if time permits, I would give you a few thoughts on your recommendations.
Please.
First, the idea of increased cooperation with Russia certainly has merit. I would only caution that the Russians have not always been willing to do more than discuss the problem of drugs coming out of Afghanistan, and so we must be realistic in our expectations and still continue to work with them. Related to that, the second recommendation to focus more efforts on our Central Asian partners is sometimes complicated by their perception that the Russians do not support our capacity building efforts. We've also experienced some difficulties implementing consistent capacity building programs based on the internal structures of security forces in these nations, periodic human rights issues, and, as with much of the world, the susceptibility of many to the drug finance corruption. It would be wonderful if we and the Russians could work in a genuinely cooperative way in the region, but again, I just caution the Caucus that we have not experienced such willingness to date. On the third recommendation regarding the Helmand Food Zone, I think we have also been pleased, as you have, Madam Chair, with the signs of success. That said, as you point out, we need to make sure that we are sensitive to the need to tailor those lessons to meet different needs in different regions. We can't just rely on a one-size-fits-all program. On the fourth recommendation to continue supporting the DEA-vetted units, as I said earlier, we wholeheartedly agree, and we stand ready to do everything we are able at DoD in that regard. On the fifth recommendation for a comprehensive CN strategy, again, that is something we would support, but we recognize the difficulty of doing that without some sense of how receptive our Afghan partners will be to our presence. On the sixth recommendation to focus more on interdiction, particularly processing labs, again, we agree this is a good tactical approach, but would defer to DEA and our INL colleagues on the right balance. That's really their area of expertise. As you can imagine, on the seventh recommendation to stop purchasing special mission wing aircraft, we do not agree. While we don't have any plan to purchase any additional aircraft, we strongly believe the special mission wing must have enough aircraft to both train air crews and develop its maintenance capabilities while still conducting CN operations, all simultaneously. Each of these activities competes with the others for aircraft. In terms of my colleague at SIGAR's recommendations, aside from the purchase of the aircraft, which has already occurred, I think we in the Special Mission Wing have acted to remedy the identified shortfalls, and we found his report very helpful as it independently confirmed for us that some of the critical next steps we need to take are the ones that we agree with him on. We have done that and believe again that this unit is increasingly capable and absolutely vital to any effective Afghan CN unit. On your final recommendation to maintain the Afghanistan Threat Finance Cell, we would also agree wholeheartedly that we need to maintain its capabilities. Here again, we would just caution the Caucus that some of the critical members of this cell are not as well resourced and may have some difficulty continuing at their current level of support. Again, we believe the fight against illicit narcotic networks moving Afghan heroin is vital and an important component of ensuring that we honor the sacrifices we have already made. This effort is also necessary to protect vulnerable populations globally, not just from the scourge of addiction, but also from the corruption and violence that these networks bring. Our adversaries make good use of these networks to destabilize territory and hurt U.S. interests. We must be equally committed to countering these threats with our own networks of creative and capable partners at home and overseas. In Afghanistan, we think the vital pieces are in place, and going forward, if we can do the three things that I've laid out, we really think that we have a chance of at least preserving where we are and, as the climate allows, growing it. I thank you again and stand by for your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Logan. Mr. Sopko, could you also, in your remarks, we put up this chart, which very much constricts your Inspector General activities of being able to evaluate American aid and projects. Could you comment as part of your opening remarks on that? Thank you.
Chairman Feinstein, Co-Chairman Grassley, and members of the caucus. Thank you for the opportunity to testify about the perilous state of the U.S. counter-narcotics effort in Afghanistan. As you know, Chairman, at your request, on my most recent trip to Afghanistan, I met with numerous officials involved in the counter-narcotics program. In the opinion of almost everyone, the situation is dire, with little prospect for improvement this year or beyond, even with the signing of a bilateral security agreement. What I learned is echoed in the latest report of the Department of Defense to Congress, commonly called the 1230 report, where they note and find that overall insurgent funding from narcotics trafficking remained largely unchanged, that the Taliban had shown a greater propensity to protect the poppy harvest and regulate narcotics trafficking and production, that international law enforcement officers no longer have the same freedom of movement as in previous reports, just as we noted up there. Those are the areas where anyone under chief of mission status, including the military, except in exceptional circumstances, cannot go beyond those areas because they have to return within an hour, 30 minutes out and 30 minutes back, to a scheduled hospital facility. So that basically limits not only the IG's GAO, but it also limits anybody under the chief of mission as well as DOD. DOD also found that the drug nexus targets have a lower priority than traditional military targets, and that with their ability to quickly adopt to new tactics, narcotics networks are likely to continue to function. And DOD reported to Congress that the net result has been a drop in the amount of drugs interdicted inside Afghanistan. They also noted that the 2012 governor-led eradication program has failed to show its utility and may actually increase insurgent funding in certain areas. Now, as part of our quarterly report data call, over the last few months, the Department of Defense has reported to me, to my staff, that number one, without military support, DE operations will center on Kabul with little ability to extend beyond the Afghan capital, and that Afghan counter-drug forces' ability to conduct complex interdictions will also be affected by the military drawdown, that there was a sharp decline in the amount of illicit narcotics seized from fiscal year 2011 to 2013, going from 98,000 kilograms of opium to 41,000 kilograms in 2013. DOD also reported to my staff that the interdiction of precursor chemicals dropped 73% between fiscal year 12 and 13, and hashish interdictions declined 79%. And that the total number of counter-drug operations in Afghanistan declined by 26% between fiscal year 12 and 13. And most troubling, DOD reported to my staff as part of his data call that when combat operations conclude at the end of 2014, the NATO-led Training, Advisory, and Assistance Mission in Afghanistan will not have the resources and capacity to support law enforcement counter-drug missions at current levels. Madam Chairman, why should we be concerned about this situation? Even though little of this opium hits American shores, we all know that the narcotics crisis in Afghanistan is a national security concern because it distorts the Afghan economy, poisons its banking sector, fuels a growing illicit economy, undermines the legitimacy of the Afghan government by stoking corruption, nourishing criminal networks, and providing approximately 30% of the financial support to the Taliban and other insurgent groups. It also puts at risk the fragile reconstruction gains we have made over the last 12 years, whether in health, education, women's issues, rule of law, or governance. Yet despite the growing threat of the narcos, terrorist, criminal nexus, the United States and other Western donors have, by and large, made counter-narcotics a lower strategic priority. Equally troubling, during my last trip, no one at our embassy or at ISAF could convincingly explain to me how, despite the strategies, but how the U.S. and coalition efforts are making a meaningful impact on the narcotics trade now. You only have to look at those statistics, senators, or after the 2014 transition. Hopefully some of my colleagues at the table may be able to explain that to you today. I was also told on my latest trip that the transition planning process for our counter-narcotics efforts conducted by the embassy in Kabul had up to November, at least, when I left, been driven more by numbers, by personnel numbers, than by a thoughtful, collaborative, interagency analysis of our programs and priorities based upon what worked and didn't work. And I was particularly warned in the area of law enforcement and anti-money laundering that was significant. In conclusion, the Afghan drug problem is growing and threatens to undermine the overall U.S. mission to build a stable Afghanistan able to defend itself and prevent terrorist groups from establishing sanctuaries there. Absent effective counter-narcotics programs and an Afghan political will, everything we have invested in both lives and treasure will be at risk. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Grassley?
Yeah, I thank you for the privilege of going ahead, and I'm going to have to leave at 4 o'clock. Is that okay? Yeah. In my opening statement, my first question is to Mr. Brownfield. I talked about the bilateral security agreement maybe not going through. In fact, just last week it was reported that the administration lead negotiator believes it's unlikely an agreement would be signed before April. So my question is, if the administration's not able to reach an agreement either until April or at all, how would those scenarios affect U.S. counter-narcotics efforts? And as a follow-up, have there been any plans laid for those scenarios?
Sure, Senator, a fair question, and it's a question where I wish I had the answer for you in terms of what is going to happen on a BSA. I do not, no one in this room does. I suppose no one on the planet does right now. I would suggest to you that our responsibility, and that is for the gentleman and the lady seated to my left, it is our responsibility.
It is lady and gentleman.
That is correct. I was going, Madam Chairman, I was going in the order in which they were seated, and I did not wish to leave any confusion that I thought Mr. Jimbo Capra was a lady, and therefore I suggested gentleman and lady to my left.
Well, we know he can blush.
My apologies for any confusion that I may have engendered thereby. I believe, Senator, that it is our responsibility to develop a strategy and an approach that can work in some way regardless of what happens to a BSA. We do you no service if we tell you we cannot do anything, plan anything, propose anything, have any programs until we have an answer to that question. My belief is what we need to do, and in fact what we are doing, is developing programs that will address all the core elements that are necessary, that we have learned over the last 30 years are necessary for a successful counter-narcotics program. Something that deals with crop control and what is being produced in the field. Something that deals with the production of the actual drug. Something that does interdiction. Something that covers money laundering and have sufficient flexibility built into it that we can adjust it up or down, move it around the country as required, and respond to the resources that are made available to us.
I think
that is the answer I can give you at this time.
Okay, yeah. So can I conclude then that you don't particularly have a specific program or scenario on paper right now, but you feel that there's enough there to draw on past practices that you'd put in place in case that you don't have that military agreement?
Yep. The way I would answer that question, Senator, is to say I believe, I hope we have a strategy and a program that is sufficiently flexible and adaptable that we could adjust it depending upon what happens, not just with the BSA, as you well know, with the results of the next election and the commitment of that government to counter-narcotics, with the political will of the Afghan people, with the support by the rest of the international community. All those are variables that at this point we don't know the answer to.
Yeah. Mr. Sopko, something related just to Iowa and our National Guard. It's my understanding that they played an important role in one of your investigations that saved the U.S. taxpayers millions of dollars. And to make clear that we have good people in Iowa. Could you tell me about that investigation and their role?
I'm happy to do that, Senator. I think the two citizen soldiers, and they really epitomize the citizen soldiers of the Guard. They were from the 1034th Combat Sustainment Support Battalion of the Iowa National Guard. And they came to our attention. One of them is Lieutenant Colonel Wesley Golden. The other one is Sergeant First Class George Tebekis. And George Tebekis is actually the mayor of the city of University Park, Iowa. His boss, the lieutenant colonel, is a science teacher at the local high school. And when the sergeant, they had the responsibility of handling fuel, and they took over from another unit, and Sergeant Tebekis said, "This doesn't make sense. I know something about storage of fuel from my work as a mayor, and we're missing fuel." And in short order, he went to his boss, and they then did some figuring. They found out there was hundreds of thousands of gallons stolen from the military. They didn't know what to do. We fortunately have law enforcement agents throughout Afghanistan. They had heard about this. They came to us, and we worked on it, and we saved, and I should say they helped save millions of dollars to the American taxpayers. So I gave them an award. I think another award was given to them by the commander in the field for their excellent work. This is what individuals can do to make a difference on fraud.
Another question for you. Your written testimony, you were somewhat critical, I should say quite critical, of the administration's effort in the area of counter-narcotics in that country. You wrote that the United States does not currently have, quote, a clear, prioritized strategy to effectively combat narcotics trade today, much less after 2014. Explain why and how you have come to that conclusion and what you think the effect of the lack of strategy is.
I think we come to that conclusion based upon what we have seen out there, what I was told by people when I go out there. I go out there every quarter. I think part of the problem we're seeing is that we may have some strategies, actually very good strategies on paper. The problem is, how are they going to work? How are they going to be implemented? You see the results. I mean, if our goal was to decrease cultivation, we failed. If our goal was to decrease the production of opium, just look at that statistics, we have failed. If our goal was to cut down on the amount of money going to the Taliban, we failed. Now, we have failed in all of those missions with a lot more resources, a lot more DEA agents, a lot more DHS agents, a lot more people doing money laundering than is proposed now under the transition planning by the State Department. So our question as the Inspector General is, how are you going to do more with less? And if you have failed up to now with 97 DEA agents, with the ability to travel around most of the country, with all of the military, how are you going to do better? Now, we hope it can do better. We are actually doing a major audit, actually at the request of a number of senators, to see what works and what doesn't. But what we were told in Afghanistan is that what was driving the train on a number of DEA agents, DHS agents, and other issues were the number. Here you have 20 agents or 30 agents or 40 agents. Have a program fit it. And that's not the way to do transition planning.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask Mr. Capper something that's a little bit outside of the issue of this committee, but very much related to drugs. You're the senior DEA official in charge of enforcement, and the department announced that they weren't going to enforce some drug laws in states that voted to have other type of marijuana policy, and a lot of this is finding its way into my state of Iowa, even though their state laws say it can't happen. What's your view on the department's new policy?
Thank you, Senator. The department put out a policy by which the U.S. attorneys and prosecutors would consider there are 8 different factors in prosecuting cases relative to marijuana. Marijuana is still a Schedule I controlled substance. It's illegal. So we're still enforcing the law. But I will tell you, I'm glad you asked me that, Senator, because I have to say this. I've been 27 years as a DEA agent, 34 years in federal government, a father of 6 great kids, and a wife who's hung out with me for 32 years. I've been serving the country since I'm 18 years old. I have to tell you this. And I served in the great state of California for 9 years as a new agent. And I went with you to Redding, California. You don't remember, there was more hair here, when we established an office up there for meth. I must tell you this, because it would be wrong for me to tell you. Going down the path to legalization in this country is reckless and irresponsible. The department has set up factors, sir, and I get that. I'm talking about the long-term impact of legalization in the United States. It scares us. The treatment people are afraid. The education people are afraid. Law enforcement is worried what is going to happen. In every part of the world where this experiment has been tried, it has failed time and time again. And here we are. The voters have decided to do this. It's going to impact the state, the surrounding states, and California's done it, ma'am. You know that. California's turned around and done a lot of great things, what they're doing, what they're seeing, and I wish some people would take example of what's happening. There are more dispensaries in Denver than there are Starbucks.
I think you're telling me that federal law ought to be enforced.
What I'm saying, sir, is the idea somehow that people have in our country, and to the extent that some legislators do, county elected officials do, that this is somehow good for us as a nation, sir. That this is good for the next generation of Americans coming up is wrong. It is a bad thing. And this body will get its door knocked on 10 years from now and say, how did we get where we get? People are going to ask us 10 years from now, how did we get where we're getting? And can I just put it in context with Afghanistan? At the International Drug Enforcement Conference that was held in Moscow, which is a planning and an operational meeting that we have every year, where we partner with new partners. Last year, we were in Moscow, 100 different nations. Can I tell you, we're sitting there, the administrator and I meeting with everyone, whether they be political leaders or law enforcement leaders. Almost everyone looked at us and said, why are you doing this? You're pointing the finger at us as a source state, and yet you turn around. I have no answer for them. I don't have an answer for them. I just don't. In 27 years ago, working in Washington Heights as a young agent, senior agents told me we could never work with Colombia. 27 years later, we have Algerians going to Colombia for best practices. I apologize for my excitement, but this is a bad experiment. It's a bad experiment, and it's going to cost the United States in terms of social costs. It's going to cost us in criminality. We have, ma'am, you need to know this. We have organizations. We just took it down in Bakersfield, and a group that took a marijuana dispensary as a front to launder its meth proceeds. We not great case with San Francisco DEA, Bakersfield, Columbia, and Miami. This is the more I'm worried about. The more states that it happened to, they're going to come. You're going to demand from me. You're going to demand from DEA. How are you going to stop that? People think that DEA and law enforcement officers around the world are interested in Billy and his bong and his basement. We're not. We never have been. That's his mother and father's problem. That's not the federal government's problem. That's not Jimmy Capper's problem in DEA. That's a mom and dad problem. What I'm interested in, what DEA has always been interested in, is the trafficking groups that want Billy to be puffing on his bong, the groups that are selling dope to our kids because they live off the backs of addiction. That's what they want. And I think sometimes I think that's sometimes get lost because there's been great things that have been done here in the United States. Been tremendous things that have been done here. But sir, you asked a question that's really, to some extent, not been answered. It's not been addressed. Ma'am, I know you have. I know you both have. But going down this road, so getting back to the department has given us factors on which prosecutors to prosecute cases. And by the way, we've never gone after, and have done that because people thought we're going after small-time traffickers. I've been DEA for 27 years, never arrested an addict, and I don't have any small-time traffickers that we don't have time for that because we're dealing with things like this on a global scale. I apologize for my
I'm going
excitement.
to submit my questions for, three more questions for answer in writing.
Okay, that's fine.
So
Thank you,
would you
Senator.
folks answer some questions I submit in writing, because I have to go? Thank you.
Thank you
And
very
thank you
much,
all for
Senator
your
Grassley.
participation.
Let me just address Mr. Capra's
I think I'm going to
statement,
stay and
which
listen to what you say.
I see one of great law enforcement frustration, and I tend to agree. I oppose the legalization of marijuana in California with most of law enforcement. We beat it back that time. Whether we'll beat it back the next time, I have no clue. I believe that it is the wrong thing to do socially. I believe that it is a gateway drug. I believe that it leads to other things, and the fronting for methamphetamine is one of them. It's one thing to use it with a doctor's prescription to ease pain, particularly in a terminal situation. I understand that. And there are probably components of certain kinds of marijuana that can be used to treat babies medically. We're seeing that happen. But to say it should be used socially on an ongoing and robust basis, and I think, your analogy that there are more marijuana stores in Denver than Starbucks is an interesting one. I wanted to ask you, Bochco was the last person brought back and tried, and that was in 2009, right?
Yes, ma'am.
The Afghan government does not have extradition treaties with us, right?
Yes, ma'am. That's correct.
So have any big traffickers been brought back since by DEA for trial in the Southern District of New York?
Not since we know, we have not had anyone turned over to us since then. However,
Have any labs been hit by DEA since then?
Oh, yeah, yes.
How many?
You mean, I'd have to get you the number. We're still actively involved in those investigations, ma'am.
I'd like to see that. You see, I believe that we're pulling out too fast. I believe that the Taliban is waiting. I believe that they now control substantial land inside of Afghanistan. That's what that circle indicates to me, that you are not safe to go except in those blue zones, correct or wrong?
I agree, Senator.
Okay, that in itself is a message of what's happening. The Taliban has a shadow government. I think that government is in wait, and we pull out, and the question comes, how long can Afghanistan even sustain its army, its military? And so I would look twice at that $700 million for certain aircraft as to whether there's going to be the ability in the future to handle that aircraft. But have you tried to arrest the DEA when in 09 and 10 was very active. They were busting labs, they were moving throughout the country, they were picking these people up. It seems to have stopped now, and the result is that last graph of a 37% increase in drug production, acreage, over 1 year.
Yeah. Senator,
Despite the food zones.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, despite the food zones.
Right. Right. No, without a doubt, we have challenges when we draw back, when we shrink our footage there collectively as a government and DOD, which, by the way, we're able to operate there in the capacity that we have because of state and DOD funding there. We only have funding for 13 positions. The reason we're able to do what we're doing is because of that. But remember that one of the, and you mentioned it in the factors that you presented, which, by the way, we agree with you 100%, is our core mission is to extend the rule of law, build those law enforcement institutions, create and stand up SIUs, much like we did. And that's why I used the term earlier talking about, when we talked about Colombia, is the ability to stand up competent law enforcement, counter-narcotics is critical. While we don't, DEA don't do the interdiction of the poppies, what we do is try to develop that competent counter-narcotic strategy by also providing technical advice like the Judicial Wire Intercept Program. Now, we have, since then, have done a number of operations there, but certainly not to the tempo that we used to do, because you need security forces, you have to be able to have medical evac and all the other things. So yeah, there's a challenge, but at the same time, we have continued to go after major drug trafficking organizations in that arena. And although we haven't, and you are rightly so, we do not have had any extraditions lately. The Afghan counter-narcotics police have gone, arrested, prosecuted individuals. Now, we do have people indicted, in the Southern District of New York that we have not had arrested yet. They are out there. We're searching for them. So we continue to do indictments. Rest assured, ma'am, we continue to do these bilateral investigations there on the ground with our SIUs, the NIUs, the TIU support as well. And what's important, and you mentioned it in your paper, the other thing that's important, before this even began, there is a regional approach as well. There has to be. And we understand that what's going to happen is, should the United States pull out completely, people say, what will it do? We do what we always do.
Let me stop you for a minute. We had a DEA person assigned to my office.
Yes, ma'am, I know.
He did great work. But he thought that this was one area where DEA could cooperate with Iran, and that we could have some mutual efforts. And you could even run it through a third country. And the Iranians are very concerned about the opiate use.
Absolutely.
And so are the Russians. Now, is there a possibility, in your view, of putting together some kind of coalition between us, Afghanistan, the Iranians, and the Russians?
Without a doubt, with the Russians, and we are working with the Russians already. With the Iranians, I know our people on the ground, with permission from the state, had discussions with some of the Iranians in the past before. The discussions were very limited. There were some issues
But what about just DEA doing that?
With the Iranians?
Yeah.
We would seek the guidance from the department, obviously, and state, but one of the things you well know, Senators, anywhere around the globe, as a law enforcement officer, we're able to sometimes breach those, people are worried about the U.S. presence here, and we look at it as we're the dope cops here. And we have an ability, one of the things that we pride ourselves in is relationships and establishing those things. And even in the surrounding countries, we've been able to do those things. So we're more than willing to continue to do that. And again, I don't want you to think these things aren't occurring right now with us.
Well, this is just my view.
Yes, ma'am.
But in my conversations with Minister Osmani, who wanted to start that Kandahar food zone, and believed that it really had to be run by the local governor, but there's also a shadow governor that's Taliban. And these governors get killed by the Taliban. So the question comes, can the food zone concept work today? Mr. Brownfield?
May I take a bite at that, Madam Chairman? The answer is yes, but no program, no strategy is so perfect that it does not require adjustment or modification. The way we tried to implement the food zone in Helmand, which in the area where we concentrated the effort actually produced exceptional results, an 80% reduction in opium poppy cultivation in the targeted area. Obviously, we learned from the experience that the area that was not targeted in Helmand saw additional growth, and we saw poppies blooming in the desert, obviously producing at a far lower level, but nevertheless, thanks to, or at least partly due to what we were doing in the targeted zone in Helmand. We have to take that into account. We have to take into account the fact that as you look at your map of Afghanistan, different provinces every year are producing more or less opium poppy. We have to have a food zone program that is sufficiently flexible that we can gear it up in Kandahar, wind it down in Helmand, do something else in Nangarhar, think about having something in 3 years in Herat that has that degree of flexibility to it. In addition, we do have to accept the fact that we do not have unlimited resources. I haven't yet read all 1,568 pages of the fiscal year 2014 appropriations bill, but I predict once I do, should I be that energetic, I will discover that the amount of resources made available to INL for purposes of Afghanistan are probably moving in a downward direction. So I then have to figure, from my perspective, where do I prioritize? How much priority do I give to what Jimmy is doing, which, by the way, I agree with your finding and recommendation, should be highest priority for interdiction. And if I'm down to my last dollar, I will probably give that dollar to support DEA's efforts. But how much then goes into Food Zone or the Good Performers Initiative or governor-led eradication? And at the end of the day, this is the problem set that we are working with. I wish I could tell you it's a simple matter of writing up a strategy, have a checklist, have a chronology or a sequencing to it, check each box, and at the end of it, we have solved the drug problem. But you know as well as I do, even in the places where it has worked, Thailand, Pakistan, Turkey, and most recently Colombia, that's not the way it has unfolded.
Well, I just happened to have the Colombian ambassador in 2 days ago, and we were talking about Plan Colombia, which I'm an appropriator, so I help fund, and how well that has done, and how they are being able to turn around some of the FARC membership, which I guess today, he said, is down to 7,000 from something like 35,000. But it's been a prodigious experience and a learning experience, and now the Colombians are providing information to other countries on how to carry out this kind of effort. Let me bring Mr. Sopko into this. You go quarterly, you see the change. We're going to pull out. The Taliban, I think, is going to come out of their holes and begin their activities again. What do you think we should do?
Madam Chairman, I usually do process, not policy, but I'll try to.
Well, try it.
I'll try to do
You
that.
might like it.
I used to work for a number of senators who used to do a lot of policy. And I remember working for Senator Nunn on issues dealing with Colombia and Peru back at Project, I think it was called Ice Cap or something like that in DEA. I remember Snow Cap. Traveling down there for him, and I remember we were debating whether to give 4 used UEs. Senator Childs was pushing for that back in the mid-'80s, and now you've seen the program has changed. Can I just say one thing? I think we should caution that each country is different. Comparing Colombia to Afghanistan is fraught with potential problems. You're dealing with two different countries.
Well, I
two
didn't
different
intend to
cultures.
do that.
Yes.
Colombia was a massive effort that had
Absolutely.
good effect.
And it has for good
Yes.
effect. And I think a lot of effort and a lot of money was spent on that, and it's not going to happen overnight. But what we need to do is we need to sit down, and by we, it's not the inspector generals, although we're going to be doing the major audit, and find out what worked and what didn't work. Now, unfortunately, we've been there for 12 years, and you would hope that somebody had done that. But designing a plan and deciding how many DE agents are there by pulling the number out of thin air is not the way to do it, Senator. That's our concern. So I think we need to know what worked and why did it work and why didn't it work.
Well, I think you have to find a substitute for the poppy, and that's hard to do. And it's hard to do with farm products. So the suggestion is, if you can do it by beginning small businesses that have some kind of production that makes some sense, that people can live by instead of the poppy, maybe that makes sense.
You're absolutely correct, Senator, but we also have to look at programs that are sustainable. Although the Helmut Food Zone project was very successful, cut back on growing of poppy there. It ended, and now production is up. So we have to watch about that. That's the concern we have about any program if the Afghans cannot sustain it. And there's the further issue, and that is they have to have a political will. The big change in Colombia was when the Colombians expressed and showed they had the political will to take on the narco traffickers. And in any country where there's success, you have to have that political will. We have basically a country which doesn't appear to have the political will. And if you look at and part of it can be because of the enormous corruption that has occurred because of the narco traffickers.
Well, I actually have to go, but let me just thank everybody. I think it's worth wrestling with this because, like it or not, there's going to be a large element of blame placed on us. And I think it was 2014, we're going to be in the process of pulling out, and what's going to happen? So we would be very interested if you would give it some thought. If you want to come back and talk to my co-chairman and myself, we're happy to do that. If you want to write us something and that we might be able to incorporate, if you have any, we're looking for ideas. So let me thank you. Let me thank you for caring. Let me thank you for what you do. And let me thank you for being here today. And the hearing is adjourned.